It was the largest gun ever built, a machine so vast, so incomprehensibly powerful, that even its name carried the weight of myth, the Schwerer Gustav. In English, Heavy Gustav. The Germans called it the superweapon that would shatter fortresses and terrify nations. Standing nearly 5 stories tall, stretching over 150 feet long, and weighing more than 1,300 tons, it was less a cannon and more a monument to human ambition and hubris. The Germans believed it could change the war, but history would prove otherwise. The story of the Schwerer Gustav begins long before the thunder of its first shot echoed across Europe. It began in the corridors of power, in the fevered dreams of German engineers and generals who sought to outbuild, outgun, and outthink every adversary. The year was 1936. Adolf Hitler, still early in his reign, stood before the architects of Germany's military-industrial machine with an impossible demand. Build a weapon capable of destroying the French Maginot Line, the formidable chain of concrete fortresses, tunnels, and artillery bunkers that shielded France's border. To Hitler, brute force was the answer to every obstacle, and he envisioned a gun so powerful it could reduce even the thickest fortifications to dust. The task fell to Krupp, Germany's most famous armaments manufacturer. For generations, the Krupp family had armed Europe, supplying cannons, shells, and steel to both allies and enemies alike. Now they would be asked to produce something unprecedented, a weapon that defied engineering limits. The project was entrusted to Erich Müller, one of Krupp's leading engineers, whose mind blended precision with daring. Under his supervision, plans began for a railway-mounted gun capable of firing shells 7 tons in weight, shells large enough to obliterate targets from more than 20 miles away. Müller's team faced challenges that bordered on the absurd. The gun's barrel alone would need to be over 100 feet long, forged from special steel that could withstand pressures exceeding anything attempted before. Every calculation was a gamble, every measurement an act of faith in the strength of German metallurgy. But to Hitler, the enormity of the task was the very point. He wanted not just a weapon, but a symbol, something that embodied the might of the Third Reich and struck awe into the hearts of both enemies and allies. By 1939, as Europe slid toward war, the design was finalized. The Schwerer Gustav would be a 31.5-inch caliber gun, meaning each shell it fired was over 2.5 feet wide. No weapon in history had approached that scale. It would fire 2 types of shells: a 7-ton armor-piercing round capable of penetrating 30 feet of concrete, and a 5-ton high-explosive shell designed to devastate enemy fortifications. The gun itself would sit atop a twin railway chassis, its immense frame requiring custom-built rails just to move it. When the gun's construction began at the Krupp works in Essen, even seasoned engineers stared in disbelief. Thousands of workers labored for months, assembling steel sections so massive that conventional cranes and tools had to be redesigned. The project was kept secret, hidden from foreign intelligence under the guise of experimental industrial work. By mid-1941, the Schwerer Gustav stood complete, a mechanical titan ready to serve the Reich. Its first test firing took place at the Rügenwalde proving ground on Germany's Baltic coast. Witnesses described the sound as unlike anything they had ever heard, a deep, rolling thunder that shook the ground for miles. Villagers nearby thought an earthquake had struck. Engineers recorded the data, confirming that the weapon could indeed launch its 7-ton shells more than 29 miles. Hitler himself attended a demonstration, his face reportedly lighting up with satisfaction as the gun's shells smashed through reinforced concrete slabs with terrifying ease. For a moment, the Führer's vision seemed realized. But war, as it always does, had changed. By the time the Schwerer Gustav was ready for deployment, the Maginot Line, the very fortification it was built to destroy, was irrelevant. In 1940, German forces had bypassed it entirely by invading France through Belgium, rendering years of French defense planning obsolete. The supergun, designed to crush the Maginot Line's bunkers, now had no target. Still, Hitler was determined to use it. Such a colossal machine, he believed, could not simply sit idle. It had to be unleashed to prove its worth and justify its staggering cost. The opportunity came in 1942 during Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht had advanced deep into Soviet territory, and by the spring of that year, one of Hitler's primary objectives was the capture of Sevastopol, the heavily fortified naval base on the Crimean Peninsula. The Soviets had transformed Sevastopol into a fortress of concrete, tunnels, and gun emplacements that seemed impervious to bombardment. Traditional artillery had failed to breach its defenses. It was here that the Schwerer Gustav would earn its place in history. Transporting the gun was a logistical nightmare. It required 25 railway cars to carry the components and another 2,500 men to assemble and operate it. Entire rail lines had to be reinforced to support its immense weight. When the convoy set out for the Crimea, it stretched for miles, a moving industrial city of soldiers, engineers, cranes, and armored escorts. It took 3 weeks just to reassemble the gun near the front lines. Soviet reconnaissance planes caught glimpses of the massive project, but by then it was too late. The Germans had already nicknamed it Dora, after the wife of the senior Krupp engineer overseeing its deployment. In June 1942, after months of preparation, the Schwerer Gustav was ready to fire in combat for the first and only time. Its target, the coastal batteries and underground fortresses guarding Sevastopol. Each shot required hours of preparation. The barrel had to be cleaned, the shell loaded by cranes, and the firing angle precisely calculated. When the first round was fired, it created a shockwave that rattled windows 20 miles away. The projectile, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, screamed across the sky before slamming into the Soviet defenses with cataclysmic force. Observers described a geyser of smoke and earth rising hundreds of feet high. Over the next several days, Gustav fired 48 rounds in total. The shells smashed through fortifications that had withstood months of traditional bombardment. One shell destroyed an underground ammunition magazine buried 90 feet beneath solid rock. Another obliterated a coastal battery that had resisted previous attacks. Soviet defenders, stunned by the devastation, described explosions so immense that men were thrown into the air by the shock waves. German reports hailed the gun as a success, crediting it with helping to break Sevastopol's defenses. By early July, the city had fallen, one of the bloodiest sieges of the Eastern Front. But even in victory, the flaws of the Schwerer Gustav were undeniable. Its fire rate was excruciatingly slow. 1 round every 30 to 45 minutes. It required constant maintenance after each firing to prevent catastrophic damage to the barrel. Every shell cost tens of thousands of Reichsmarks, and the logistics of supplying it were staggering. Moving it even a few miles required dismantling the entire weapon and rebuilding it along new sections of reinforced track. The Germans had built the largest gun in human history, but they had also built an anchor, a weapon too massive to adapt to the fast-paced mobile warfare that defined the Eastern Front. Hitler, however, was not ready to admit defeat. Plans were drawn for an even larger gun, the Langer Gustav, which would have fired a 9-ton shell over 90 miles. But the tides of war were turning. The German army's fortunes in the Soviet Union began to wane after the disaster at Stalingrad. Resources dwindled, priorities shifted, and the age of the superweapon began to fade. The Schwerer Gustav, once hailed as the pinnacle of engineering, now stood as a monument to misplaced ambition. Still, the gun was redeployed one last time. In early 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, Gustav was transported to Poland to participate in the siege of Warsaw. But by then the front lines were collapsing, and air superiority had shifted decisively to the Allies. The gun never fired again. Constant bombing raids made deployment impossible. In the chaos of retreat, German engineers dismantled and destroyed the Schwerer Gustav to prevent its capture. When Allied forces reached the area months later, they found only twisted steel, shattered barrels, and the remnants of a dream that had turned into a ruin. In many ways, the Schwerer Gustav represented the extremes of Nazi engineering. Immense ambition combined with a failure to grasp the realities of modern warfare. It was a marvel of metallurgy, logistics, and design, yet it embodied the fatal flaw of the Third Reich, an obsession with spectacle over practicality. For all its power, the gun's strategic value was negligible. It had fired fewer than 50 rounds in combat, destroyed a handful of targets, and consumed resources that could have produced dozens of tanks, planes, or field guns. Even within the German High Command, opinions were divided. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who led the assault on Sevastopol, later admitted that while the gun's psychological impact was significant, its tactical contribution was limited. The men admired it, he wrote, but they also knew that it was too much effort for too little gain. His assessment reflected a growing awareness within the German military that the age of the giant gun was over. Warfare had evolved, and mobility, air power, and speed now reigned supreme. The men who operated the Schwerer Gustav spoke of it with a mixture of pride and weariness. Many were artillery specialists and engineers who had spent years mastering the complexities of the weapon. Their accounts reveal both awe at its scale and frustration at its limitations. It was like feeding a steel monster, one crewman recalled. Every day it demanded men, fuel, food, and effort. It devoured everything and gave back only noise and destruction. In the aftermath of its final firing, as the German front collapsed and Allied bombers roamed freely over Europe, the Schwerer Gustav stood as an anachronism, a relic of an era that was ending even as it unfolded. Its massive shells, once symbols of power, were now useless. Its rails, once pathways to victory, led only to retreat. When Soviet troops eventually uncovered fragments of the gun, they were astonished by its sheer scale. Engineers examined the remains, measuring the barrel and carriage, documenting the details for study. But even they, hardened by years of brutal warfare, recognized the futility of such a creation. It was impressive, one Soviet officer remarked, but it was already obsolete. The fate of the Schwerer Gustav mirrored that of the regime that built it. Grand in vision, catastrophic in execution. It was an embodiment of overconfidence, of a belief that engineering prowess alone could overcome the realities of logistics, mobility, and human cost. The gun had been a dream of total power, the illusion that brute force could substitute for strategy. In truth, it revealed the opposite, that power without purpose is self-defeating. As historians later reflected, the Schwerer Gustav was both a triumph and a tragedy of design. It demonstrated the heights of human engineering, yet underscored the folly of ignoring context and consequence. Its very existence was a paradox, a symbol of genius deployed in service of madness. And perhaps that is why the story of the Schwerer Gustav still resonates. It is not simply about steel and gunpowder, but about the limits of human ambition. It reminds us that technology, however advanced, cannot escape the moral and strategic realities of the world it inhabits. The Germans built the largest cannon ever made, and in doing so, revealed something profound about themselves and about war itself. The Schwerer Gustav was meant to make history. It did, but not as its creators intended. Instead of reshaping the world, it became a cautionary tale, a monument to the dangers of arrogance disguised as innovation. The Schwerer Gustav lay in ruins. What had once been the pride of German engineering, the crown jewel of the Reich's Superweapon program, was now little more than twisted metal and scattered memory. When the smoke of war finally cleared in 1945, Allied engineers stood among its shattered remains, their eyes tracing the contours of a machine so vast that it seemed almost alien. One of them reportedly whispered, What kind of madness builds this? To understand the true legacy of the Schwerer Gustav, one must look beyond the steel and rivets, beyond the numbers and statistics, and see what it revealed about the world that made it possible. The gun was more than an instrument of war. It was a statement of belief. A belief that man, through sheer force of will and machinery, could dominate nature, crush his enemies, and rewrite the laws of battle. Yet in the end, that very belief collapsed under its own weight. By 1943, as Germany's fortunes began to fade, the Schwerer Gustav stood as both a weapon and a warning. The tide of war had turned decisively. The Allies had mastered air superiority. Tanks and aircraft moved faster than rail lines could be laid. The very foundations of modern warfare were shifting beneath Germany's feet. And yet, Hitler and his circle clung to the illusion of technological miracles, Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, that would somehow reverse the inevitable. The Schwerer Gustav was the forerunner of that obsession. It was the physical embodiment of Hitler's faith in spectacle. That power could be displayed as much as it was applied. Each massive shell fired from Gustav's barrel was as much a performance as a military operation. The thunderous blast was meant to echo across the continent, proclaiming German dominance to friend and foe alike. But as the war dragged on, and as Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble, that illusion began to crumble. In Essen, where the Krupp works once roared with the sounds of industry, the air fell silent. Allied bombing raids targeted the factories that had built Germany's might. The forges that once produced Gustav's massive shells were reduced to ashes. Workers fled or were conscripted into desperate defensive militias. Among them were the same engineers who had once stood proudly beside their steel behemoth, now forced to confront the bitter truth. Their masterpiece had achieved nothing lasting. Erich Müller, the lead engineer who had overseen the Schwerer Gustav's design, reportedly lamented to a colleague late in the war, "We built a monument, not a weapon." His words captured the tragic irony of the entire project. The gun had fired fewer than 50 times in combat, contributed marginally to one siege, and spent the rest of its life idle. Too large to move, too fragile to hide, too slow to matter. And yet, even as its utility faded, its symbolism grew. For those who saw it, Gustav represented the extreme limits of industrial warfare. It was the dream of total control, the fantasy that through machines, humanity could bend history itself. But the world it helped create was one of exhaustion, destruction, and despair. Behind every ton of steel and powder were the hands of men, engineers, soldiers, and laborers, each bound to a system that demanded ever greater sacrifices for ever-diminishing returns. The men who operated the Schwerer Gustav rarely spoke of it after the war. Many were captured, others scattered, and a few were killed during the chaotic retreat through Poland. Those who survived described the weapon in tones of mixed pride and sorrow. One recalled the first time he saw the barrel being hoisted into place. It was like watching a mountain being built. We believed we were part of something that would change history. But when I think of it now, it was madness. That word, madness, appears again and again in recollections of the superweapon era. For Germany, the pursuit of ever larger, ever more spectacular machines had become an addiction. The Schwerer Gustav was followed by projects that bordered on fantasy. The Landkreuzer P-1000 Ratte, a tank the size of a building, the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, and countless other miracle weapons, conceived in the dying days of the Reich. Each was born of desperation, the hope that technology could succeed where strategy had failed. Yet among these monstrous inventions, Gustav stands apart. It was not merely a weapon of destruction, but a reflection of an entire philosophy. It represented the belief that fear itself could be engineered, that by building something so vast, so terrifying, an enemy's will could be broken before a shot was fired. This was the same logic that led to the construction of the Maginot Line before the war. The same illusion that walls, guns, and machines could make war predictable, containable, controllable. History would shatter that illusion again and again. When the Soviets advanced into Poland in early 1945, they found the remnants of the Schwerer Gustav near the town of Auerbach. It had been sabotaged by retreating German troops. The barrel had been blown apart, the breech destroyed. Soviet engineers examined what was left, noting the immense size of the steel forgings. Some fragments were shipped back to Moscow for study. But in the end, even they concluded that such a weapon belonged to the past. The Red Army's victories were being won not by giants of steel, but by speed, coordination, and endurance. By men and machines working together, not monuments to pride. The Allies, too, studied the concept. American ordnance officers were fascinated by the sheer audacity of the design, though they quickly realized it had little practical value. One U.S. report described it as a marvel of engineering, but a failure of purpose. Another concluded, its construction represents the point at which ingenuity becomes obsession. The United States and Britain, instead, poured their resources into technologies that offered flexibility and power. Aircraft, radar, and eventually the atomic bomb. And so, while Gustav rusted away in a field in post-war Germany, a new age of weaponry began. The contrast could not have been greater. The Schwerer Gustav fired shells that weighed 7 tons and traveled at 2/3 the speed of sound. The atomic bomb, by comparison, delivered the equivalent of 20,000 tons of TNT in a single instant. One was a mountain of steel that had to be hauled on rails by thousands of men. The other fit inside a single plane's bomb bay. The age of brute force had ended. The age of science had begun. But still, there was something haunting about the Schwerer Gustav. For those who saw it, or even the photographs that survived, it stirred a kind of grim fascination. There was beauty in its symmetry, in the way its barrel arched toward the sky like a cathedral spire of metal. It was, in a sense, a mechanical sculpture, an artifact of an era when industry and ideology intertwined to create machines that mirrored human ambition. The same minds that built the Gustav could have built bridges, ships, or factories. Instead, they built an instrument of destruction so large that it defied common sense. In the years following the war, as Germany lay divided and rebuilding, the story of the Schwerer Gustav faded into obscurity. The Krupp company, once synonymous with German might, shifted its focus to civilian industry. The engineers who had designed the gun rarely spoke of it publicly. Some were even ashamed. When interviewed in the 1950s, a former Krupp metallurgist said quietly, "We thought we were building for Germany's future. We were building for its ruin." Yet history has a way of remembering symbols, and Gustav's legend refused to die. Photographs of the gun began appearing in post-war books and magazines, often accompanied by awestruck captions describing its size and power. To many in the West, it seemed almost mythical, a relic of an age when war was fought with giant machines and unrestrained ambition. But for those who understood its true story, it was something else entirely, a cautionary tale of how intelligence, when blinded by ideology, can become self-destructive. Military historians continue to study Gustav, not for its tactical success, but for what it represents. It stands as an extreme example of how technological innovation can become divorced from practical need. The gun's existence forces a question that echoes through every era of warfare. When does progress cease to be advancement and become vanity? The engineers of the 20th century, like those of ancient empires, often discovered that line only after crossing it. The Schwerer Gustav also holds a deeper human lesson, one about the nature of ambition itself. Every bolt, every gear, every rail beneath that gun was forged by hands, by men who believed they were building something great. They worked long hours in dimly lit factories, driven by pride, fear, or necessity. Many were not ideologues, but craftsmen, swept up in the current of history. In that sense, the gun was not merely a Nazi project, it was a human one. It was proof of what humanity can achieve, and a warning of what happens when achievement loses its purpose. In a world still recovering from war, that warning was easy to forget. Within a decade of the Schwerer Gustav's destruction, nations around the world were once again competing to build bigger and deadlier weapons. The Cold War had begun, and the quest for ultimate power had taken on a new form. Where Germany had once built a 1,300-ton gun to hurl steel across miles, America and the Soviet Union now built missiles capable of crossing oceans. The race for dominance never ended. It simply changed its shape. And yet, amid all that progress, the lesson of the Schwerer Gustav lingered quietly in the background. For those who studied the ruins of World War II, for the soldiers who had seen what machines could do to men, there was a growing awareness that size and power were not the same as strength. Victory in modern warfare depended not on spectacle, but on intelligence, adaptability, and restraint. Today, remnants of the Schwerer Gustav can still be found. Fragments of steel buried in old railway embankments, photographs in dusty archives, and a few surviving shells displayed in museums. Tourists who see them often stare in disbelief, unable to comprehend that such a thing ever existed. It feels like a relic from a lost world, a world where humanity's reach exceeded its grasp, where faith in machines eclipsed faith in reason. In many ways, the story of the Schwerer Gustav is the story of the 20th century itself, a story of brilliance and blindness, of progress and peril. It is a reminder that the same ingenuity that builds skyscrapers and satellites can also build engines of destruction. What matters is not the power we create, but the purpose we give it. When the last shell was fired from the Schwerer Gustav in 1942, no one could have known that it would mark both a peak and an end, the culmination of centuries of artillery development and the twilight of an era. From the cannons of Napoleon to the guns of Verdun, the story of warfare had always been one of bigger, longer, heavier. But Gustav was the final word in that language. After it, there was nowhere left to go. The future belonged to precision, not mass, to science, not spectacle. But the lesson of Gustav endures, echoing like the thunder of its first shot. Power without wisdom is ruin. So when we look back at the photographs of that colossal gun, the soldiers dwarfed beneath its barrel, the engineers standing proudly beside their creation, we see more than metal. We see a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal struggle between creation and destruction, between reason and pride. The Schwerer Gustav was not merely a failure of engineering. It was a failure of understanding, a failure to see that true strength lies not in the size of one's weapons, but in the wisdom to know when not to use them. Its thunder has long since faded. The rails that bore its weight have rusted away. But its lesson remains, carved into the memory of history, that no machine, however mighty, can conquer the limits of human folly. And perhaps in that silence after its final shot lies the truest sound of all, the echo of a world learning at last that power untempered by purpose will always destroy itself.